Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to Fueling Equity, a video series where we use conversations and stories to highlight, educate, and communicate our important work to create a more equitable future for our employees, our customers, and our communities. Today, a few weeks ahead of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, I'm really delighted to have joining us Lisa Chang, Global Chief People Officer of the Coca-Cola Company. In her role, Lisa oversees the company's talent and people strategies, culture, and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. She's responsible for leading the company's global people strategy, which is aligned to the company's purpose of refreshing the world and making a difference. Lisa and her team are focused on creating an environment where employees can thrive and equipping the organization to win. Now, Lisa has held HR roles at various companies, including Equifax, Turner Broadcasting System, and the Weather Channel companies. She also serves on the board of Catalyst, a nonprofit organization with a mission to accelerate progress for women through workplace inclusion. So Lisa, it is great to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
You know, I want to start with something. So you were at Turner Broadcasting and the Weather Channel, and our first interview I had was with Wanya Lucas, who has also been at Turner Broadcasting and the Weather Channel. Did you all happen to cross paths ever?
Absolutely. We absolutely did. We actually did a flip-flop. I was at Weather when we recruited her over from Turner, and then I left Weather and went to Turner. So we sort of crossed paths in that, but Wanya is an amazing individual, great leader, and I consider her to be a good friend. So yes, she's wonderful.
That's terrific. It's a wonderful opportunity to have a network with such great leaders and great people. And you're right, she's dynamite. Well, to get us started, tell us a little bit more about you, where you grew up, a little bit maybe about your family, and kind of how you began to get into the world of HR and media.
Yeah, sure. Well, my parents immigrated to the U.S. from Taiwan. I was born here in the States in a small little town in Southwest Virginia. And so I had quite the different experience from a lot of immigrant families. But I grew up in Virginia. I went to school at UVA. The plan, according to the parents' life plan, was I was supposed to go to medical school, like every good daughter. And I got halfway through my second year of college and realized that I don't really like blood. I don't really like sick, environments and hospitals. And so that could probably get in the way of the chosen profession for myself. So it was at that point that I decided I probably needed to find another career. And I landed in communications as my major. Later, I had an internship that actually put me in an HR department for a company. And that's really where I got my taste of, wow, what is this HR thing? Back then it was called personnel. Mm-hmm. And so it was a quite different experience, but it was, nonetheless, it was with a high-tech company. And I had an opportunity to work in recruitment and work in training and development. And it sort of stuck that this was an area that I could see myself doing. And that just sort of took its a life form of its own. And once I graduated from college, I found my way into an HR role, doing things like compensation and analysis and generalist and recruitment. And it just kind of laid itself out for me as a career path. I'm really to this day the only member of my family that has a liberal arts degree. Everyone else is an engineer or a scientist of some sort. So they're still trying to figure out where my gene pool came from.
I love that. Well, so where do you think that came from? And as you were, moving along in your career, where did you get inspiration to do something that, again, as you described, comparatively speaking, was a little outside of the norm?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it comes from the combination of my parents. So my father is a PhD metallurgical engineer. My mom, who really never worked, but she has multiple degrees in biology and nursing and some other things, was really more of the warm people person. My dad, again, traditional engineer. So I think the combination of the two is sort of what developed me into the role that I have today. I always tried to find the business sense of what I was doing, because I had this strong need to prove that whatever I was doing was valid, right? Because when I first told my dad I wanted to get a liberal arts degree, he just kind of looked at me like, well, how do you plan to feed yourself? Because, anyone with a liberal arts degree can't actually work, can they? And so we moved on from that into, what has been, by most standards, a fairly successful career. So I think it's the combination of that. I think for me, what I learned from both of them, again, being an immigrant family, is the value of the hard work, as well as education. So I feel very fortunate that as an immigrant family, the reason my parents brought us to the United States was for better education and better access. So that was always honed in for my brothers and myself to try to provide as much education as we could. But I think from my mother, what I learned was treating people fairly and inclusively. And so whether it was, my father always said this, he worked his way up to an executive at a high tech company and eventually started his own company. But he was always very clear that there was no hierarchy, and that everybody should be treated fairly and consistently. And whether it was the person working on the front line of the production line, or the executive of the company, or the person working in the janitorial services, everybody was a person and should be treated respectfully and equally. And so I think for me, the combination of those personalities really translated into my philosophy about people in general, and just the need to be kind to people and treat them all like humans and not put labels on them. So I have them to thank for that.
Wow, what wonderful inspiration and guidance. And I know that your parents are very proud of you. So in this series, we're talking about issues that are impacting different groups of people. And certainly what we've seen a lot of lately, I know it's not new to you, is what's going on in the world of Asian Americans and this anti-Asian American hate that we're seeing. So I want to get into that, but first let's start a little bit. You talked about your family's focus on education and hard work. And unfortunately, a stereotype of Asian Americans is that they are hard workers, but that they might be a little bit more passive or even submissive at times and aren't necessarily looked at as great leaders. So how has that stereotype impacted you, your career path and your career decisions? And how have you faced that? And, how have you worked to overcome it?
Yeah, such a great question. I mean, I think it's the struggle that many Asian Americans have. As you said, culturally, it's not the norm in the Asian culture to be boisterous or bragful or anything like that. And so, I grew up in a small town in Southwest Virginia, and we were very much told by my parents to try to assimilate as possible, to keep your head down, to just really try to blend in, don't cause too much attention to yourself. That would help us, be more accepted by the community. And fortunately for us, we grew up in a lovely place and people were very accepting of us. And, there weren't really any issues to speak of. It wasn't until I went to college that I started to experience some of the things that people are talking about more openly today, in terms of people treating me differently. And I was a little confused by that, because I really had convinced myself that I was, quote, normal, and didn't understand why there would be a distinction between me and my roommate, who was, a Caucasian. But I think that what's important for me was, what I learned along the way was certainly being able to be confident, which doesn't have to exclude being quiet. So, I think a lot of times, because Asians tend to be a little more subdued, the assumption is that they aren't good leaders because they may not have the confidence or the ability to lead people. And so what I tried to balance in my own career was the need to be able to speak about the things that I felt comfortable speaking about in a way that would show people that I can be a capable leader without having to be a leader that maybe carried hierarchy or a need to carry title, right? And so in all of my roles throughout all of my career, what I've tried to do is just be the best at what my job is, irregardless of title and level and function, but just really be the best at what I try to be at. And that has served me well. I will say that when I assumed one of the more senior level positions earlier in my career, I did get a CEO that said to me, you know, you need to speak up more. So around the executive table, I was there, and it's where I aspired to be. But he just kind of said, look, we're not getting the benefit of what I know you're capable of doing. And I had to process thinking through, why am I not speaking up? And some of it was a little bit of the cultural. I was respecting, quote, people that had more experience than me, and I was allowing them to speak first. And then I was only adding if I felt like what I had to say could potentially add, as opposed to, what I later worked with an executive coach said, it's not for you to decide if what you add adds value. It's for others to have the benefit of hearing, what you have to say. That's the reason you're at the table. So it took time and energy and effort. And I think many executives, and this is also a female attribute, many of us as women leaders also have a little bit of a hard time speaking up until we're fully sure that we know everything about what we're talking about. And that's not really something that you have to do. But I think we have a little bit of a stereotype that, you only speak when you can speak, efficiently and elegantly about every single thing. But I think what we've learned is, nobody has all the answers and nobody's perfect. And part of the process is just sharing for the purposes of learning and iterating. So that's taken some time as well. But it's learned behavior, and it also has to be reinforced by cultures and environments that welcome that, because I know that there are a lot of cultures that don't welcome that, and that's where it perpetuates people not speaking up.
Right. That's great advice for all of us. And that is exactly the type of culture we are trying to create, is a speak up culture, to make sure that we are all allies for each other. And I think what you're describing is, that the person who gave you that advice is really, that was a gift. And for you to internalize that and act on it is something that, again, all of us can learn from. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And you talked about not really feeling different until you got into college. And I have heard the title of, or at least the subject of, a thesis that you worked on. Can you talk about that thesis and how you've seen any progress, if at all, over the last 30 years or so?
Yeah. It's so interesting because I hadn't thought about it recently. Obviously, it was 30 years ago when I wrote this paper. But with the most recent incidents of the violence against the AAPI community and just the visceral hate that seems to be perpetuated, it triggered in my mind this thesis that I wrote. So my study as a senior in college was around communications and the media. And at the time, the paper was focused on the representation or lack thereof of Asians in the mass media. And so again, 30 years ago, if you looked at television, if you looked at movies, if you looked at, any of the streaming video services at the time, there were very few Asians in those roles. And if they were in stereotypical roles. They were the servants, they were the foreigners that came into the country that didn't speak a lot of English or spoke broken English. They ran the dry cleaners. They did, And so my thesis was around, why is it? Because Asians have been in this country since the 1800s. Why is it that there is still this perception of the foreigner concept with Asians and Asian Americans? Because, I was born and raised in Southwest Virginia. And if not for how I look, I think if you spoke to me on the phone, you probably wouldn't know that I look Asian. But yet, on a regular basis, I still get people asking me, when did you come to this country? And your English is so good. And it's just startling. We've kind of come to accept that that's what, people's just lack of knowledge and awareness. But after a while, it gets a little old. And especially like my children are 2 generations removed. One of them has never actually been to Taiwan, which is where my family's from. And yet people still ask him questions like that. So, but what's sad, unfortunately, about this thesis that I wrote was the premise around it was the perpetuation of stereotypes caused by events. And so at the time in 1982, Vincent Chen, who was a gentleman that lived in Detroit, was chased down and murdered by 2 Detroit auto workers because they thought he was Japanese. And he wasn't Japanese, he was a Chinese American. And at the time, what was happening in the economy was the US auto workers were losing their jobs because they were losing market share of automobiles to the Japanese automakers. And so these 2 former auto workers were just upset and frustrated and just assumed that because he looked the way he looked, that he must be Japanese, and therefore he may have had something to do with the lack of their employment. And so again, 30 years ago, senseless crime, which by the way, they were never charged with murder or manslaughter or anything. They were fined $3,000. And so fast forward to what has happened even here in Atlanta just a few short weeks ago, and the just horrible murders of 8 individuals, 6 of who were Asian American women. All the things that are happening around the elderly in cities around the world for no reason than just, perceived stereotypes and hate of people being injured. And it's just sad to think that in 30 years, we're still having the same conversation and people don't seem to understand that, people of Asian descent have every right to be here. We're fully employed, we're taxpayers, many of us serve in the military, many of us serve political offices, but it is unfortunately a sad reality.
It is heartbreaking to hear about the large increases in the numbers of crimes against Asian Americans. And as you mentioned, this terrible tragedy in Atlanta is just awful. How has or have these events impacted you and other Asian Americans? And what would you want to make sure that those of us who are not Asian Americans know about that, and how can we help?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for asking. I mean, I think that's step one, which is awareness and interest. At Coca-Cola, we have hosted a couple of events. One was a Stand as One session where myself, Nancy Kwan, who is the head of our technical organization, Alfredo Rivera, who's our CEO of the North America business, brought employees together to talk about what's been happening with Asians. And that alone sent, I think, a strong message to our employees about the support that we're here, that we're listening, and we had employees of ours speaking out and sharing their own personal stories. And the sharing of the stories is so much more impactful than us giving a list of things to say you should or shouldn't do this. But when our employees were able to hear from their coworkers some of the very emotional incidents that have occurred to them personally or family members, it's heartbreaking. And you make that personal connection into how is it possible that something like this could happen? So talking about it, providing support, just checking in, just like the Black Lives Matter situation when people were feeling so much emotion and rage, just having someone reaching out and tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, I'm just checking in. How are you doing? I see you, I feel you, I hear you. That's really helpful. And I do think, and hopefully it won't be for naught, but the recent publicity around people speaking up about the AAPI hate and really shining a light on these stories is helping people feel like we can finally, raise our heads up and speak because people are listening. So I think just giving people a platform, encouraging them to seek support from each other. And like I said, the sharing of the stories alone, just the fact that, if you know who I am, it's startling to you that somebody would stop me at the store and ask me, how long I've been in this country, or, some other questions like that. Or, my son, who is in high school here, was approached during the pandemic, and his friend's family wanted to know if we were from China and if we had been to China recently, because they were concerned about possibly carrying the coronavirus. It's shocking, but it happens. And so you can think about what happens to some of the women, like the ones that work in these frontline positions at the spas and the nail salons and these other places where, they are definitely perceived as foreigners because of the language barriers, et cetera. So I think, again, just awareness and raising a hand and encouraging people to get the support that they need.
Wow, it's so disappointing that this is happening. And what you just described about your son and the experience that he has just reminds me that all of us who are listening to this and are working to have these conversations, and sometimes we call them uncomfortable conversations, because we haven't really been, I believe, as open as a society as we are now. And I appreciate what you're saying about what's happening at Coca-Cola. But I think it's really important for those of us who have children to be communicating with our children as well about all of these topics and sharing and this was something Wanya described, and I've heard from other employees. African-American parents have conversations with their sons and daughters that Caucasians don't. And I hear what you're saying. You have some conversations with your children, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And then what advice would you give us as parents to help our children make sure that our children are sensitive to what your children may be going through?
So it's interesting because I've thought about this a lot recently, obviously as a mother, but certainly as someone in the seat that I hold, about these conversations, because I think my conversations with my children have been different than the conversations my parents had with me. And whether it's because I was born and raised here and I sit in the seat that I sit today, or whether it's just because it's a sign of the times. But, as I said, because I grew up in such a small town, my parents, as new immigrants to this country, were very much like, keep your head down, assimilate, don't be different. We tried really hard to distinguish our external presence with our internal presence. Like the home life was very traditional Asian. We had the Asian foods, we did all those things. But when we were external, we tried to sort of portray a very Americanized persona. And it was really, and I don't see it as being they were trying to wash away our history, but they just felt like that was what was needed to be accepted, right? And that was, again, back in the 60s and 70s. So what I've done with my children, which I think, again, is a sign of hopefully the times, is my kids were actually born here. Most of them have never traveled to Taiwan. And we've actually tried to do the opposite, which is we have encouraged them to learn and embrace the history and the culture. Because we've said to them, that's what makes you special. That's the diversity that you bring to the school, the company, the friend network, everything. You've got these really different experiences that make you interesting, right? So just like, somebody has a grandmother that lives in London, you have grandparents that live in Taiwan, so that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's something to celebrate. And we should, educate people on that. And so what we've tried to do, again, is just, my kids are probably more Taiwanese than I was growing up, because we've introduced the foods to them. We've introduced the cultures to them. They've done the same thing with their friends. My daughter, for one of her birthdays when she was in middle school, we had a dumpling making party as her birthday party, and her friends thought that was amazing and cool. I would have never done that, because that would have been like a little too much of showing the culture and the heritage. So I think, again, being able to transition into an environment where differences are celebrated. I mean, that's the foundation of our country, right? That's why people came here, is because they wanted to have freedoms, and we are the consummate melting pot. So that is something that I've really tried to instill in my kids, is just being proud of the background that they bring.
I love that. And I also hear you saying, for those of us, again, who are talking with our children, just that it is okay to ask and to and be interested in learning more about your friends and their heritage and their backgrounds, and just having those conversations about celebrating differences. I love that. Um, so let me just transition a little bit to just being a mom. And you kind of talked about that and the conversations that you have with your children about their Taiwanese background. But I work with a lot of women and men who just really struggle with trying to balance raising their children and doing as much as possible at work. So how do you feel that you were able to do it? You have 3 children, and just tell us a little bit about your kids and kind of how you make all that work with your incredible role at Coca-Cola and your incredible role as a mom of 3 wonderful children.
Yes. Well, thank you. My favorite subject to talk about. They are my greatest achievements. So my daughter, my oldest is 24. She's graduated from college and working. And my middle son is 19. He's a freshman in college. And then my youngest will be 15, freshman in high school. And so, look, you and I were talking about this before we started. This past year has been an extraordinary time for working parents, and I can't really imagine the hardship that people have had to go through with virtual schooling and, keeping their kids safe and not being able to see friends or travel or do anything. And so my hat and heart goes out to all the families that have had to sustain that. I mean, what I would say for me as I look back on being a young working mom with 3 kids, it certainly wasn't easy. And, I know you have 2 kids of your own. We made sacrifices to balance and juggle our careers along the way. And there were many times when I would scratch my head and say, okay, is this the right thing to be doing? Is this not the right thing to be doing? And there are a couple of examples of things that I tried to do that it's the moments of validation that I received that it was going to be okay. So I think I'm just one of those people that likes to work. I like to stay busy. I like to contribute. I like to make a difference. And so there was a point in time when my daughter, I think, was about 6 years old, and I was taking her to school, and it was a Mother's Day brunch or coffee or tea or something, and I was not going to be able to join because of a work commitment. And I felt horribly guilty. And I remember driving her to school and just apologizing and saying, look, unfortunately, Mama can't come today because I have this meeting, but, I love you, and we'll do our own tea party when we get home. And, I was feeling horribly guilty. And I said to her, does it bother you that Mommy works? And, spry little 6-year-old, no, I think it's really cool that you work. And at the time I was working at the Weather Channel. So of course she thought I was like the weather person or something. And so I was like, okay, I'm good. So that happened. And then fast forward many, many years when my youngest was in kindergarten as well, and I was traveling for business. I was supposed to be the mystery reader. Did you have that with your kids? Where you're supposed to,
Yes.
come in and they don't know who's coming and they're all excited about it. And I was supposed to be the mystery reader, and I had rescheduled a couple of times. This is when I was working at Turner. And I just thought, I can't reschedule again, because he kept saying to me, Mom, when are you going to be the mystery reader? Because the year was coming along and I had not quite done it yet. And so finally I was like, I'm doing it. I don't care what it takes. And so this was many years ago, before Zoom calls and everything were all the norm. I think Skype was the only option that you had. So I actually went to the school and I planned with the teacher, and I said, hey, look, I'm going to be in London, but there's this thing you can download on your computer called Skype, and we can do this video thing. So maybe I could do the reading from London. And she was all game. So literally we set up Skype on her computer. Like I said, I was working at Turner at the time, and Turner owned Cartoon Network. And so I found a conference room in London that had Cartoon Network in the background, so it looked like I was really cool or whatever. And I did the mystery reading via video. And can I tell you that is probably the only time he ever remembers me being the mystery reader, although I've done it many times in person. So the fact that was, and so I think you do what you have to do. Mm-hmm. And what's important is not that you're there every minute of the day, but the moments that matter. And that when you do it in a way that shows your whole heart. And so it's not easy. We all have to make the sacrifices along the way. But I think, again, the good news is the environments now that we have many more women that are leaders and men are coming out more and saying, hey, family is important. The acceptance of the juggling act that we're all doing is out there. There were times early in my days with when I had infants that it wasn't quite accepted to have, a lactation room. I mean, I was just reading something the other day about the number of places, working moms have had to pump, because lactation rooms were not a thing. And you had to find closets and bathrooms and, dark rooms and things to get out of the way. And now it's at least part of the conversation about how do we support the working moms. So
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I can identify completely with your story and feeling the guilt more even than our kids do and not being able to be somewhere. But I love that you were creative and innovative in doing the Skype. So you're right. But at the end of the day, it's hard. But we just have to keep moving one day at a time, one foot in front of the other, and keeping it all together. But certainly your children are proud of you and proud to talk about their mom, and it really is worth it to be able to do the things that you love. And I also love what I do, and I think our children understand that as well. So so let's wrap up a little bit, but I want to mention to you, and again, first of all, thank you so much for participating and help sharing some of your experiences and your stories, because they are really valuable. And at Southern Company Gas, we have a process that we call fueling equity. And the three tenets of that are listen, learn, and lead. And certainly what everybody is going to be doing, thanks to your time today, is listening and doing some learning. Do you have any recommendations as to other ways we can learn specifically about the experiences of the AAPI community? Are there movies, videos, podcasts, anything else that you might point us to?
Yeah, we can certainly send you a list of things that we curated that we've shared with our employees.
Thank you.
Georgia Public Broadcasting has recently released 5 episodes of a work that they did before on the history of Asian Americans and sort of going back to the 1800s when Asians first immigrated here through the gold rush. And I think that's a helpful context to kind of see, again, where Asians have been. I think, right now, because it is normalized that we're talking about it, some of the things that have been kind of coined, the phrases of the model minority and some of these things, it's helpful to read and understand what is really meant by that. Because while it's meant to be, quote, a compliment, it actually doesn't help the Asian American community to be called the model minority, because the whole distinction between that is that, this, as Asians, most of us have been able to come over and be successful. And so we were not, suppressed or oppressed, as the case may be, as some other immigrants may have been. We've been able to rise above that. I think it gives a false sense of equalization that isn't true, because again, it's sort of the tale of two cities. You got the people that, like my family, who had the great fortune of being able to pursue education, which helped us, get to the point that we are. And then you have other immigrants who are working very low wage jobs just to make ends meet. And so I think understanding the full context and the landscape, and also understanding, and this I think is really important, that when you say Asian American, you're talking about hundreds of countries. Mm-hmm. You're not talking about 2 countries. You're not talking about 5 countries. The Asian American population is so broad. It covers India, it covers, Asia, it covers the Philippines, because, it's so broad. And all of those are subcultures that have their own sense of values, their own sense of culture, their own sense of things that they are proud of and that they are unique. And so getting to learn the difference between what is the Japanese culture, what's a Vietnamese culture, what's common in Singapore or the Philippines or Thailand. They're all so different, but we get clumped into one group as being Asian. And so the assumption and the stereotypes, which is why, the COVID-19 situation has been so harmful, being referred to in sort of, the China virus way, is because anybody that looked Asian was immediately assumed to be affiliated with China, when many of us and most of us aren't Chinese or have never been to China. So understanding the difference between all the different distinctions is just a respectful way to get to know, or asking people and saying, hey, where is your family from? And asking questions about the difference between Vietnamese and Thai and Filipino. And I love when people want to understand that, because it shows that they're taking an interest in it. So anyway,
that's really great advice. And our goal is to lead in this area, and we are working on that. And your advice and your stories and your help is going to lift us up and move us forward. So again, thank you very much for spending time with us today. Is there anything else that you would want to just close with?
I just want to thank you. I want to thank Southern Company Gas for the commitment that you have. We have a very similar framework around our social justice efforts, which is leading, listening, investing, and advocating. And so I think your model is similar, which is we all want to go on the journey together. And I think you, as the leader of the company, setting that standard is definitely much appreciated. And we are appreciative of the leadership that you're providing.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, so much. And thanks to everyone who watched today's episode of Fueling Equity. I look forward to more important conversations in the future to continue to move us forward. Together, we can build a more equitable tomorrow. Thank you all very much.